Welcome to today's event. I'm John Levin. I'm the Dean of the Graduate School of Business here at Stanford. And it's my pleasure to welcome you to today's session on gender equality in 2019. What is it going to take to get us there? So today is a celebration, and it's also, I think as the title implies, a call to action. And we're going to have the opportunity this afternoon to hear from four terrific scholars about their research to understand the progress and in some cases, the stall in progress toward gender equality, and then they're going to share their thoughts on the question that has been posed. What is it going to take to get us there? So today's panel was assembled by Shelley Carell. Shelley's the Michelle Mercer and Bruce Golden Family Chair in Women's Leadership, also Professor of Organizational Behavior by courtesy here at the GSB. And this is actually, as Shelley told me before the event, this is a very special event because this is Shelley's, the final event to mark Shelley's tenure as the director of the Clayman Institute for Gender Research, which she has led tremendously for quite a number of years at this point. So maybe a round of applause for Shelley. Many of your admirers have turned out today, Shelley. So of course, Shelley's will be continuing her work because of the launch of the VMware Women's Leadership Lab. And I think, as you all know, Shelley she has really been a pioneer in what you might call translational social science. She's been in some ways revolutionary in moving questions out of the ivory tower and into workplaces and co-designing interventions with managers and working with firms. And that is a type of research that is very hard to do and takes a lot of work and takes a lot of organizational leadership as well as scholarly brilliance and being able to write and communicate. And she has really pioneered that effort in a great way that I think many others are going to follow in the field. And so it's really exciting to have seen that happen here at Stanford. I'm also, I have to say I'm incredibly happy that we're having this event here at the GSB. At the GSB, we have a strong belief that people do their best work in environments where their contributions are valued and that foster a sense of belonging. That's really what Shelley's work and the work at the VMware Lab and at the Clayman Institute has been all about. A key part of our mission is to educate future business leaders, and that means providing them with the knowledge and the skills and the mindsets to tackle tough issues that are facing society and to be able to lead in all different types of organizations. And one of the skills that all of our students will need in the future is the ability to lead diverse organizations and to foster environments where everyone in the organization can thrive. And again, that's really what the message that what we learned from the work that's been going on at Clayman, we're going to hear about today. So I hope everyone's going to learn a lot today. I know I am. We're going to hopefully take away some great ideas about organizations and about action and about progress toward gender equality. And I'm really excited to hear from Aaron Seck and David Padula and Adina Sterling, who are the scholars we're going to hear from. And let me finish by asking you to give one more warm round of applause for Shelley Carell as I invite her up.
Thank you. Thank you, Dean Levin, for that wonderful introduction and for co-sponsoring this event and for all the great partnerships over the last 9 years. And I want to just welcome everyone here today. I got a chance to look at the RSVP list earlier, and as I was looking over it, I just see that there's so many people in the room that I've worked so closely with in different capacities over my directorship, and the work that we've done, we've really done together. So I really am so honored to see such a great crowd here today, and including people I didn't even expect to be coming, like my brother and sister-in-law. Welcome. So when I became the Clayman Director 9 years ago, the first event that I hosted was called Can We Move Beyond the Stalled Gender Revolution? And this title refers to a well-documented trend in research that shows that the progress towards gender equality has stalled or plateaued since about the mid-1990s on several different measures of gender equality. So, for example, if you think of the gender wage gap, as this graph shows, it narrowed appreciably throughout the 70s and the decade following the passage of the civil rights laws that made sex discrimination illegal. That wage gap starts to narrow. By the time we get to the 1980s, it's narrowing, but at a slower rate. And since about the mid-1990s, it's bumped up and down, but overall, there's not been a lot of progress there. The same is true with movement of women into leadership. Last fall, we got to celebrate the largest number of women ever entering into Congress, and that's a moment really worth celebrating. But even with, yes, clap for that. Even with that advancement, what we see is still only about 24% of congressional seats are held by women. So 76% then are held by men in a country that's supposed to be a representative democracy. And of course, we've never had a woman at the very top of our federal government. When we go to the university sector, we see similar kind of lack of progress at the top. Since the early 1980s, women have earned more bachelor's degrees than men, but still only 8% of the presidencies of our research universities in this country are held by women. And then at the corporate sector, this is a new figure that's going to be coming out in June when they announce the percentage of women who are Fortune 500 CEOs, and that is 6.6%. And it's being billed as an all-time high, which it is, but that's 33 women, and it was 32 2 years ago, so we're not like skyrocketing to the top. And while we don't have the new numbers, the breakdown of those numbers yet for this year, we know that last year of all the women that were Fortune 500 CEOs, only one of them was a woman of color. So there's a lot of progress that needs to be made here. And as I've been thinking about these things for the past 9 years as the Clayman Director, really the focus of my directorship has been trying to understand why this stall is occurring, and more importantly, what we can do to jumpstart progress towards gender equality. And so that's what takes us to the theme today, gender equality in 2019. What's it going to take to get us here? And I want to say that the session today is really meant to provide some answers to that question. We're not going to solve the problem of gender inequality this afternoon. If you came hoping for that, you're going to be disappointed. But I do think we're going to leave with some good ideas. We have a wonderful panel of experts who are going to draw on their research to explain some of the important barriers that continue to block our progress towards gender equality. And importantly, we'll start to share some suggestions for how to move forward. In designing today's session, I was told I needed to have a session to celebrate being a director, and I'm not one who likes to have myself celebrated. But I decided if I was going to do that, I was going to design it my way. And so what I wanted to do was really showcase the top 2 priorities of my directorship. The first has been to conduct research on how to advance gender equality and to put that research into action to help bring about more equitable organizations. The second priority was to develop and support the next generation of gender scholars. To advance this goal of putting research into action, I've worked with a wonderful team of Stanford staff, Stanford students, and faculty from across Stanford and across the country, as well as practitioners in both profit and nonprofit organizations, schools, and universities. And through this work, it's become increasingly clear to me that achieving gender equality is going to require a sustained commitment by large collaborations of people from diverse backgrounds. Now, this type of commitment, it was really built into the very fabric of the Clayman Institute when it was founded in 1974, 45 years ago, and Professor Myra Strober became its first director. At the time, and this was pretty early on in 1974, Stanford provided Myra with some funding to get this institute started, but there was a stipulation attached to that money, okay? She had to promise that she would shut the institute down as soon as gender equality was achieved. She, of course, agreed to these terms. Who thought that was going to... And here we are in 2019, still pushing for gender equality. So my first priority was to put this kind of research into action and build the collaborations to do so. The second priority has been to develop and support the next generation of gender scholars. Over the past 9 years, with support from generous donors, the Vice Provost for Graduate Education's office, and other offices and departments on campus, the Institute has supported graduate students, postdoctoral fellows, and junior faculty. To showcase these two priorities, a commitment to research and supporting the next generation of gender scholars, I decided what I wanted to do was invite 3 junior faculty whose work I deeply admired and for whom I've had some role in mentoring them to join me in sharing their research. And happily, when I asked these 3, they all immediately agreed. So what we're going to do today is we're going to start with a presentation by Professor Erin Seck, who's an assistant professor at the Department of Sociology at the University of Michigan, and she was a Clayman postdoctoral fellow several years back, which is how I got to know her. Then second will be David Padula, professor of sociology here at Stanford, and since he came to Stanford, I've been his official mentor and have enjoyed getting to learn more about his research. And then third will be Adina Sterling, who's assistant professor of organizational behavior here in the Graduate School of Business. And while I've had no official role in mentoring Adina, we've had many a conversation since she's joined Stanford about research, about teaching, and about research that has social impact. Each of these scholars will have about 15 minutes to talk about what they see as continued barriers to gender equality and to share that research that helps us both understand those barriers and helps us think about how to get beyond them. And then after the 3 of them have spoken, I will come up and offer a few remarks. Then we'll have time for a few questions, and then we will have a reception out in the courtyard on the beautiful day that we have dialed up for us. So it's been a mixed bag lately. So with no further ado, what I will do is I'm going to turn it over to Erin to offer her remarks first, and then we will just go in turn without me coming up to the stage in between. Okay. Thank you.
Good afternoon. I'm so excited to be here, and I will be talking a little bit about my research and a little bit about Shelley, because, of course. Let me make sure that my slides, let's see. Oh, very good. Okay. I have been a fan of Shelley Carell for at least a dozen years, as I'm assuming most of us in this room have been as well. And I was ecstatic to be chosen as a postdoc in the 2011-2012 years. The summer before I started my postdoc, I was at the American Sociological Association meetings, which for a variety of complicated reasons was in Las Vegas, Nevada, at Caesar's Palace. And I was in this very hallway walking in one direction past this lovely statue, and Shelley Carell was walking toward me. And I was walking with a friend of mine, and I had accepted the postdoc and was excited, but I hadn't had a whole lot of interaction with Shelley before then. And I saw Shelley, and I smiled, and she smiled and nodded, and I totally fangirled and brought my friend over to the base of this statue and said, "Oh my God, that was Shelley Carell. I want to be like her when I grow up." And I'm happy to say that nearly a decade later, my feelings have not changed a bit. I probably don't have to work too hard to convince this audience that my year at the Clayman Institute was the most intellectually exciting, intellectually nourishing year of my life. During that year, we celebrated the 40th anniversary of Ms. Magazine with Gloria Steinem herself, and kicked off the 3-year Redesigning, Redefining Work initiative. It was electric. Clayman was also a vigorously interdisciplinary space that took the communication of gender scholarship to the public as seriously as it took that scholarship itself. My connections with Clayman under Shelley's leadership taught me how to do scholarship with an eye for social change. In my talk today, other than trying to embarrass Shelley with heaps of well-deserved praise, I want to highlight some of my work, especially in the arena of the stalling and unstalling of the gender revolution that has deeply been inspired by Shelley's own work. Very broadly, the question that drives my research is, how does culture reproduce inequality? And I'm especially interested in those cultural processes and beliefs that are not overtly prejudiced or discriminatory, but rather those things that seem innocuous or benign on their surface, things that seem to fly under the radar of liberal egalitarian expectations for equal treatment. I've been especially inspired by Shelley's invitation to us to consider the supply side of gender inequality. This is a quotation from her 2001 American Journal of Sociology article. She said, Certainly, discrimination and other structural constraints continue to limit the occupational opportunities available to women. However, a fuller understanding of the persistence of sex segregation in the labor force can be gleaned by also examining the seemingly voluntary processes by which men and women make career-relevant choices. Here, she invites us to explore the possible supply-side mechanisms that might perpetuate gender inequality, especially those that are anchored in culture. As a young scholar, this invitation allowed me to think seriously about individual-level processes and inspired me to focus on cultural mechanisms of gender inequality that seem hidden in plain sight in people's seemingly voluntary, idiosyncratic choices and actions. One of those seemingly benign cultural processes, and one I'll focus on today, is self-expression. While self-expression can be extremely positive at the individual level, I argue that it can serve as a powerful but largely unseen force reproducing gender inequality in the aggregate. Of course, individualistic self-expression is ubiquitous in the United States. It's a cultural demand, a cultural expectation of us. My favorite articulation of this comes from a book called Habits of the Heart, where the authors write, "We believe in the dignity, indeed the sacredness of the individual. Anything that would violate our right to think for ourselves, make our own decisions, live our lives as we see fit, is not only morally wrong, it is sacrilegious." Self-expression is how we perform individualism. But in stark contrast to this expectation for self-expression, modern workplaces expect obedient, devoted, ideal workers who put the needs and interests of their employers far above their own. So given this juxtaposition of the structural requirements of the workforce and the cultural ubiquity of self-expression, my research asks, how do career aspirants define good work and good career decision-making? And what might this mean for inequality? I argue that what I call the passion principle is a predominant definition of good work and good career decision-making, particularly but not exclusively among the college-educated. I define the passion principle as the cultural schema that elevates self-expression in the form of one's intellectual, emotional, and/or personal connections to an occupational field as the singular or central guiding principle in career decision-making. I find that passion is often a prerequisite for career decision-making among college students, and that passion is often more predominant in students' ideas about good work than things like salary or job security or even family plans. I also find that adherence to the passion principle is extremely common among the college-educated workforce generally. This passion principle implores us to search out work that is meaningful and fosters our personal investment in our paid work. I argue that while the passion principle may be beneficial at the individual level by helping people identify work that fosters fulfillment, the passion principle might actually help to reproduce a variety of unequal labor market processes in the aggregate. In one study, I examined the connection between passion-based decision-making and the reproduction of occupational gender segregation. As a bit of background, as Shelley noted, sex segregation in occupations is so pervasive that about 50% of women or men would have to change jobs in order for us to obtain gender parity. Sex segregation remains one of the most consequential factors in economic gender inequality more broadly and disadvantages women in prestige, in pay, and in power. Through socialization processes and gendered interactional expectations that begin at childhood and continue throughout our lives, we become ourselves through the lens of gender. Our gender identity, whether given or chosen, becomes part of us. It becomes part of ourselves. As such, when we make self-expressive decisions, we tend to reinforce the very gendered institutions that help to create those selves in the first place. The kicker is, though, even self-expressive behaviors that are highly gender-conforming can feel individualistic rather than gendered. As such, a host of deeply gendered processes might become cloaked as idiosyncratic self-expression. In this study, I was interested in whether men's and women's expression of their gendered self-conceptions predicted their contributions to occupational sex segregation. Using a longitudinal survey of students from 4 different universities, who I followed from the time that they were first years all the way through graduation and then into the workforce, I found that women who perceived themselves as emotional, unsystematic, and people-oriented were more likely than other women to go into more female-dominated fields, and that men who perceived themselves as less emotional and more systematic were more likely to go into more male-dominated fields. So as expected, I found that women and men express their self-conceptions in their choices of occupational field, and that in turn often helps to reproduce sex segregation. But I also found that it's not just that women qua women help to reproduce occupational sex segregation by entering female-dominated fields, but that this self-expression helps to reproduce the cultural gender typing of these fields as culturally masculine and culturally feminine domains. So for example, men who believe that they are unsystematic are more likely to go into more female-dominated fields, like preschool teaching. This helps to break down the demographic imbalance of this field while reproducing the cultural perceptions of preschool teaching as a place for people who are unsystematic. I found that self-conceptions matter net of respondents' beliefs about gender. This means that even men and women with the most progressive gender schemas, those who are feminists, those who reject gender essentialism, will still reproduce occupational sex segregation if they hold gender-typical self-conceptions. In other words, this passion seeking helps to prop up sex segregation, regardless of women's and men's commitments to gender equality. Occupational sex segregation is thus a specific example of this connection between self-expression and gender inequality. But passion principle, I argue, has other implications. In a book I'm currently working on, I talk about several other ways there's a connection between passion and the reproduction of inequality. So for example, the passion principle might help perpetuate class inequalities among college students. I find that passion seeking often requires safety nets and springboards that are typical usually only of those who are middle class or upper class students. Second, I find that the passion principle might actually help to reproduce the ideal worker norm, especially in among white-collar workers. Because with the career for which people have passion, career aspirants are often willing to work long hours with extensive work dedication without pushing for change, demanding shorter work hours or more leisure time, for example. Third, I find that the passion principle might have a demand side. In an experiment, I found that the potential employers tend to prefer and benefit from passionate applicants, but don't necessarily reward them anymore. As such, the passion principle might serve as an important but underexplored mechanism of exploitation in the labor force. So this focus on self-expression as a mechanism of inequality is, I think, an important extension of Shelley's invitation to us to consider the supply side. On the one hand, self-expressive behaviors and actions are usually psychologically beneficial to individuals. But on the other hand, self-expression might retrench a variety of processes of gender inequality in the aggregate. These processes largely operate without coercion or overt discrimination. They are often a degree removed from the gender socialization and policing procedures that created gendered selves in the first place. Thus, I think these things are extraordinarily difficult to address with policy solutions and social change. This is not a sign you're going to be seeing at a march anytime soon. Americans are strongly resistant to having our self-expressive freedoms taken away. Social activism or advocacy that would propose to reduce this self-expression is likely culturally untenable. Thus, the only viable solutions, and the ones that avoid putting blame on members of disadvantaged groups to change their self-expression, are those that address the structural and cultural environments in which such decisions are made. In short, self-expression is an important supply-side mechanism of gender inequality, an example of how a seemingly inclusive agentic cultural process can reproduce unequal social structures in the aggregate. But beyond her path-making scholarship, Shelley's leadership at the Clayman Institute has inspired me in other ways as well. Through her work at Clayman, Shelley has taught me how to make my work relevant to the constituencies I study. She has pioneered new ways of doing public sociology, of getting in the trenches with the organizations she studies. This, I think, is perfectly articulated in her comment in the Gendered Society article. She said, "For reasons we understand all too well, progress toward gender equality has been slow, uneven, and often met with resistance. However, our scholarly community is well poised to intervene, empowering people who desire to be agents of positive change to better achieve their goals. If we as academics can find ways to collaborate with those organizational actors, then together we can jumpstart progress toward gender equality." Shelley has taught me how to speak my sociological truth to hegemonic institutions. Throughout her time at Clayman, she taught us how to engage, how to push, and how to partner with agents of change. And I've taken this to heart as to the extent I have been able to in my work, particularly in equality and STEM work. I've embraced opportunities to engage in conversations about diversity and inclusion in some of the most powerful science and engineering institutions in the country. Shelley taught me how to be brave in this action and maybe a little bit irreverent when talking to institutions of power. She taught me how to teach others how to be agents of positive change. So I want to thank you, Shelley, for your incredible leadership over the last 9 years. You are a visionary that has impacted so many lives. In fact, if Shelley Carell has personally impacted your life as a colleague, as a mentor, or as a point of inspiration, can you raise your hand? Shelley, can you stand up, please, and take a look? This, Shelley, is your legacy. Thank you for inspiring us all to join you in making the world a more equitable place.
We got some beer up there. Awesome. Well, good afternoon, everyone. And I want to start by saying thank you to Shelley for inviting me to be on this panel. It's a real honor to speak among some of my favorite gender scholars in the country. I want to start today by sharing an excerpt from one of Shelley's articles that was published in the American Journal of Sociology in 2007 that examined the motherhood penalty in the labor market. Her and her co-authors write in the discussion and conclusion of the paper, quote, "First, we isolate and experimentally evaluate a status-based discrimination mechanism that is proposed to explain some of the disadvantages mothers experience in the paid labor market. The second contribution we make in this project is to show that real employers discriminate against mothers. Ours is the first audit study to test for hiring discrimination on the basis of parental status, and therefore the first to provide causal evidence that mothers experience hiring discrimination," end quote. To say that Shelley's scholarship has fundamentally shaped my research agenda would be a dramatic understatement. While there are multiple ways that her theoretical advancements have informed my thinking, her methodological approach has also been central to me as a scholar. Sociologists have long used experimental techniques, but Shelley's work has significantly advanced the use of experiments in mainstream sociology, in part by bringing together complementary experimental techniques. For example, in this paper on the motherhood penalty, she brings together lab experimental techniques with field experimental techniques, and it's the combination of these approaches that offers incredible traction on the mechanisms underlying the relationships between key variables, while also showing us how these variables play out in the real world and paying close attention to causality at every turn. Indeed, I found this approach so powerful and exciting that I say I took a play out of Shelley's playbook for my dissertation and essentially took this method and applied it to a different set of issues. So I think it's fair to say I would not be on the stage today if it weren't for the work that Shelley had done in paving the way for this type of research in sociology. What I want to focus on today is I want to think about the intersection between masculinity and gender inequality, and specifically, I want to think about the ways that men and the constructions of masculinity are important in stalling out the gendered revolution. In essence, what I want to argue is that men and their behaviors, or lack thereof, have been a key roadblock to advancing gender inequality, both in the workplace and the home. And specifically what I'm going to focus on is masculinity norms. So I want to think about the ways that we've constructed both what it means to be a man, so descriptive stereotypes and descriptive expectations about men, and also what men should be, or normative or prescriptive stereotypes about what men should be. And here specifically I'm going to be focusing on issues of breadwinner norms and the idea that men should be the primary kind of financial caretaker of their families. And I think that this has real consequences both within workplaces as well as in the domestic sphere and the home. So I'll start by talking a bit about masculinity norms in the labor market and specifically focusing on the case of hiring decisions. So I spend a lot of my time thinking about hiring decision making, and I think hiring decisions are a really useful lens into ways that gender and other social statuses shape evaluation processes. And in particular, I'm interested in hiring because the hiring process is what allows people access to employment, which we know is central to issues of economic security, as well as social standing within the broader world. So what I'm going to do today is I'm going to present evidence from a field experiment or an audit study similar to the one that Shelley ran in the motherhood penalty study, where I sent out thousands of fake job applications to apply for real job openings. And what I was interested in is thinking about first gender, and how gender influences hiring. And so I manipulated the gender on a set of job applicants by using different names at the top of the resumes. So you can think about Emily Stevens versus Matthew Stevens, for instance. So that was my first manipulation. My second manipulation was I was really interested in changing people's employment histories, right? And so I started with some applicants got a seamless, continuous, full-time employment trajectory. Some applicants got a year of unemployment before they applied for a job. But then what I was most interested in was thinking about what would happen if we randomly assigned men and women to have a history working in a part-time position, okay? Part-time work in the United States is highly feminized. Oftentimes we think of part-time work as being used to balance work and family life, and therefore it may have certain gendered connotations to future employers. So I wanted to see how would employers respond to this signal. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to present some findings from this field experiment. Here on the y-axis, we have the callback rate from employers, or their positive response to applicants with different characteristics. I'll first present the findings for men, for full-time employment, part-time work, and unemployment, and then for women with the same employment histories. So what we can see here is that men who had seamless, continuous full-time employment histories were called back for jobs about 10% of the time, which is quite standard in this literature. When I randomly assign men a history of part-time employment, the callback rate drops down to 4.8%. This is a large, negative, statistically significant penalty for men who had part-time histories. And indeed, the callback rate for men with a spell of unemployment was just 4.2%, quite similar to that of part-time work. So for men, what we see are real negative consequences of both part-time work and unemployment for their likelihood of getting a callback for a job. For women, we see a callback rate of 10.4%, similar to men, but then I was interested, how do employers think about part-time work for women? What's interesting is there's no negative effect. Okay, women who have moved into a part-time position receive callback rates on par with women who remained in full-time employment. We see a slight drop-off for women who were unemployed, although it's not as severe as it is for men. So I saw these findings and got really interested in the why question. What's going on underneath this pattern that can help us understand why these patterns emerge? So I spent a lot of the past few years thinking about this issue, running different types of studies, but what I want to present today is some evidence from in-depth interviews that I conducted with hiring professionals about how they think and talk about part-time work and gender. So at the beginning of the interview, we kind of talked about broad hiring processes, how individuals think about the hiring process at their company. And then I asked them, how do you think about part-time work? If you were to see an applicant with a part-time history, what would you think? Then we talk about that for a little bit, and I'd ask them, would your thoughts differ if it was a man or a woman? In response to that question, Amanda, a talent acquisition specialist in the retail sector, said to me, quote, I would say that if a man was working part-time, it's my internal bias. I would definitely look at that a little bit differently. I think because in our society, women tend to work part-time more often than men, especially women who have families. So if it's a man, I think I would definitely question that a little bit more before talking. I think we're just taught that men bring home the bacon and women take care of the homes, end quote. And what I think is really revelatory about this statement is it points to the idea that these gender norms around what men and women are supposed to do and how they're supposed to behave in the labor market has real consequences for how part-time work was evaluated, and that men who move into these part-time positions aren't living up to the masculinity norm of being a breadwinner. Towards the end of my interviews, I pivoted and I actually presented some of my field experimental findings to my interview subjects and asked them to help me think through why these patterns may have emerged. So when I presented the findings about men being penalized for part-time work and women not facing a penalty, I asked respondents, why do you think that might be the case? Responding to this question, Joyce, an HR director in retail, said to me, quote, a woman probably has an excuse to be working part-time, and we expect her to come like full of baggage. Whereas a man, we expect minimal baggage. So like, what's he doing with his free time? End quote. And I think this is a powerful quote, right? Because it points to the ways that, well, in the case of part-time employment, women may not be penalized at the hiring interface. This conception of women being full of baggage, right? This can have real negative consequences for women within the workplace in terms of promotion, wage setting, termination, et cetera, right? So these norms go both ways. They can disadvantage men in certain situations and disadvantage women in others. And I think it's really important to think about how these norms play out for both men and women. So next I want to move on and think a little bit about solutions, okay? So we know that gender norms are really important in the labor market and can disadvantage men and women. What can we do to potentially move forward or think about closing the gender gap? And so for that, I'm going to turn to thinking about something a little bit different, which is going to be work-family policies and the work-family interface. So we know that navigating the balance between work life and home life is one of the key inequality-generating mechanisms in the economy. When we run surveys now, we know that men and women say that they would ideally like to have egalitarian relationships and kind of split things 50-50 between housework and paid labor, but in practice, that's far from reality. So one of the proposed solutions to allow men and women to actually live out the types of things that they would like in their relationships is to have better work-family policies. So things like parental leave, which is what I'll talk about today, flexible scheduling, subsidized childcare, right? If we have these suite of work-family policies that may actually reduce some of the gender inequality in the workplace and the home. What's interesting is when you look across data sets, you see that women are much more likely to use work-family policies even when they're equally available to both men and women. And some of the theory around why that's the case is that it has to do with these masculinity norms again, right? That there's some sort of stigma for men using these types of work-family policies that can lead to various negative outcomes within the workplace. So I wanted to get some traction on whether we could actually move the needle on this or help to close the gender gap in using or at least intentions to use work-family policies. So myself, along with a co-author, Sarah Tabo at UC Santa Barbara, who's actually one of Shelley's students, asked individuals to imagine that their company offered a parental leave policy, and then we asked them on a scale from 1 to 100 how likely they would be to use the policy if they were to have a new child. We experimentally manipulated in the background both the financial costs of the policy, so some respondents were told that it would be an unpaid 12-week leave, other respondents were told that they would receive full pay for the 12-week leave, and we also manipulated the stigma of the organizational context that we asked them to imagine that they were working in. Some respondents were told that their manager had recently indicated that there may be some penalties in terms of promotions for using the policy. We also had a reassurance condition where some respondents were told that their manager had recently indicated that there would be no penalties for using the work-family policy. And we ran this experiment on a nationally representative sample of just over 2,000 respondents between the ages of 18 and 44 years old who were actively in the labor force in the United States. So what I'm going to show real quickly is just the predicted means, or you can think about these as just the mean differences between men and women in their stated likelihood of using the parental leave policy. That's on the y-axis. And first what I'm going to show you is the differences in a condition where it was unpaid leave and there was a promotion penalty that was primed for them. And here we see a 25-point gap on a 100-point scale in the likelihood of men and women using the parental leave policy. And I should say this effect size aligns roughly with what we see in a lot of nationally representative surveys of the use of work-family policies. So then what we wanted to ask is, can we close this gap? So in the next set of bars, what I'm going to show you is what happens when we told people to imagine that their manager had recently reassured them that that there would be no promotion penalties. And we see that the gender gap goes away. There's a huge bump for men in indicating that they'd be likely to use the policy. In the next condition, we primed people to say that there was 100% pay, but still a promotion penalty. Again, the gender gap doesn't exist. And then when there's both 100% pay and promotion reassurance, we see no gender gap as well. Okay. So just to wrap up, I want to think about a few key takeaways from these findings that I presented today. The first is that masculinity norms have important consequences in the world of work as well as in people's home lives. As I showed, men face penalties when they've been working part-time that women do not face. And from Shelley's work, we know that women can face penalties for parenthood that men do not face. I also think that these findings point in important ways to that we're not necessarily stuck in this pattern. There are organizational and institutional contexts and things we can do and implement in order to shift norms and expectations. And indeed, I showed that at least in the survey experiment, the gender gap in intentions to use work-family policies can be attenuated. So as you can see, my work drawing on field and survey experiments builds substantially on Shelley's scholarship. But I want to close today by mentioning how much Shelley has impacted my career beyond her research. So I'll share one quick story before I wrap up. When I arrived at Stanford 3 years ago, I had my introductory meeting with the chair of the sociology department. We were talking about getting acclimated to Stanford, and he said, Stanford has this policy where all junior faculty get a senior faculty mentor within their department that they get to choose. And he said, who would you like to be your mentor? And I remember thinking to myself, does anyone not say Shelley? How is that possible? And so I was delighted when Shelley agreed to be my formal mentor. And the ways that she's guided me and supported me and really been a rock for me in more ways than I could outline here over the past 3 years are just incredible. And my only hope, Shelley, is that I can pay that forward to the next generation in any little way that you've shared your wisdom and your guidance with me. So thank you for everything.
I will start my comments with a confession, which is what David, Aaron, and I had planned to do was start all of our talks with a quote from Shelley's research. And David and Aaron did that, but what I found was as I was going through my own preparations for this, if I started with a quote, I just couldn't get through it, and it was just too emotional. So I'm gonna stick to the research part of my talk first, and then I'll come back to all of the really wonderful things that you've done for my career and for me, Shelley. So thank you. So my talk today is about the gender wage gap, which Shelley teed up very nicely, and which also we are all very familiar with. Wherever we go around the world, a gender wage gap exists. If we look at where the gender wage gap has made the most progress in any country in any region of the world, men and women still have a huge gap in their overall earnings. In the United States, that gap is at around 72%, and it's much worse, it's much larger if we look at it from an intersectionality standpoint. So Black women and Latinx women make on average between 58 and 62% of what white men make. And so this persistent gender gap, which exists all over the world, very much has seen a trend over time that has stalled. And so Shelley teed up a lot of this in her opening remarks, but here's some data from the United States Census Bureau. In 1979, it was the first year that the US Census Bureau ever tracked the median salaries for men and women in the United States. At that time, women were making 62% on average of what men were making. That continued to improve until about the year 2000. And in 2004, women for the first time made around 80% of what men made. And now that number has really stagnated. For the last 15 years, women have made on average between 80 and 82.5% of what men have made, and we've never crossed that 83% number. And so we can think about this question of the gender wage gap and the lack of a narrowing of it over time and ask ourselves why. And there are all sorts of explanations for this. And Aaron, I think, very nicely teed up many of these from a supply side standpoint. We, of course, know that women self-select into jobs and occupations and employers that may pay less than men. We certainly also know that once they're in those jobs, occupations, and employers, they have competing demands on their time that men might not face. I'm not going to talk any more about any of that today. I'm going to instead focus on what happens within organizations and how organizations value the labor of men and women differently. What I'm going to put forward for you today is what I call the initial disadvantage hypothesis. The initial disadvantage hypothesis focuses on the initial salaries that men and women make for two reasons. The first is when men and women first enter the labor market, they are the most similar that they will ever be at any point in their careers. For professional women in the United States, they on average don't have their first child until they're 29 and a half years old. And so when they're entering their professions for the first time in their mid-20s, they don't have competing demands on their time. And so of all the times that we should expect men and women to be paid the same, it's in their initial jobs and in the context of those initial salaries. The second reason I focus on the initial salaries that men and women make in understanding how we can narrow the gender wage gap is fundamentally it has to do with this notion of how salaries change over time, and that baseline salary being really important because of the compounding effects of salaries. So if women and men can make the same initially, they will then have the same baseline upon which their salaries can grow and accumulate. So the question that we can ask ourselves is, all right, how can those initial salaries start out the same? And that's really what this research is going to speak to today. In order to think about this, I thought hard about the differences between inequity and inequality. Inequity has to do with the value of labor being unfairly valued instead of just differentially valued. That is, if individuals have the same quality, them being paid less versus them having different levels of quality, and their level of quality simply being reflected in the wages that they have. And so if we're going to address the gender wage gap, we have to be certain in a lot of ways that inequity is the root cause of the gap that exists in wages when men and women are first entering the labor market. So how might we do that? And just an example of why this is so hard to pick up from a research standpoint, I have an example. So let's say there are two applicants. There's Anne, and then there is Jack. And Anne and Jack are both interviewed by an employer, and a conversation happens afterwards about Anne and Jack. And the employer is looking at both sets of resumes, and they're saying things like, you know, Anne and Jack, they look pretty good, equally on paper. And then one of the hiring managers says, yeah, but maybe not during the interviews. And the other says, yeah, I know, Jack is really the clear leader. And so the other interviewer says, yeah, you know, he really seems like he epitomizes leadership and just really has that kind of classic leadership style that we're looking for. And then the other one says, yeah, you know, Anne didn't fit that leadership style that we wanted to see. And then all of a sudden, at the end of the day, Jack makes more than Anne, or Jack is put into a position where he's paid more than Anne would make, okay? And so in every research study, that is the researcher's dilemma. We are not in the room to figure out how good Jack or Anne actually are, and we are not privy, typically, to these kinds of conversations, right? And so the question is how we can pick up on inequity in the allocation of salaries instead of just inequality in the allocation of salaries. So the research that I did built upon this idea of a tryout, okay? So a tryout you can think of as any time an individual gets to try out in an organization prior to starting, okay? So here you can think about internships or temp to perm hiring. And what happens is, in the top scenario, if it's a traditional hiring process, an individual has an interview. If they do well, they get an offer. After that, they're provided a salary. In comparison, in a tryout process, they do that interview, they get an offer, they get a salary, and then they spend some time in the organization. And the organization gets the chance to firsthand assess that individual's skills, abilities, their leadership potential. And after that, they're hired and provided a second salary. What that does, that period of time in an organization in which an organization gets to see how good somebody is, I argue makes a fundamental difference in how they are valued and assessed. In many ways, this is getting the organizations themselves to admit who is really good. Once I see them post-hire in this tryout, if I make an adjustment, lo and behold, I then figure out this person was really worthwhile in the organization and I ought to pay them in ways that reflects their value. And so overall in this research, what I expected was that after a tryout period, women's salaries would be adjusted upward more than men's because their initial salaries are decreased in the labor market traditionally. All right, so how do you study something like this? Okay, well, one of the things that you have to say is that it's not going to be perfect, that certainly in the context of tryouts, there is some bias that might persist, but your baseline comparison is the level of bias that they would otherwise experience in the labor market itself. Okay? But once they're in an organization and in this tryout period, they have the opportunity to interact with other individuals, they have the opportunity to demonstrate their skills, and so we ought to see a decrease in bias compared to the bias that we would expect in the labor market. Okay? All right, so how do you study something like this? So I did this work joint with a collaborator at MIT. We took a look at 2 cohorts of MBA students over time, and we saw their salaries that were offered from many, many different sources. So we looked at their salaries coming from referrals, their salaries coming from internships, their salaries coming from direct opportunities to be hired. 97% of our sample did an internship. All of these internships lasted about 12 weeks, and overall, we got their salaries before they were hired, into the internship, and after. And let me show you what we found.
Women make less than men. Why? Women differ in the types of jobs they take versus men. So that may be one reason. But do employers contribute to the gender wage gap? To figure this out, we developed a new approach. We studied what happens when people are hired for an internship, then hired again for a full-time job. We studied this among professionally trained managers from an elite business school. Some managers had an internship first, some did not. We found women's salaries are adjusted more than men's from internships. Women receive lower salary offers than men in general. But if that offer came after an internship, women and men receive the same average salary. This suggests, in the absence of on-the-job information collected during an internship, women's skills and abilities, and hence their starting salaries in organizations, may be discounted. In our study, we thought a lot about alternative explanations for reaching average parity in men and women's starting salaries, besides internships yielding information. We ruled out alternative explanations, such as negotiation effects and standard salaries being offered after internships. In additional analysis in which we examined mechanisms, we found evidence suggesting information is at least one reason for the leveling effect of internships.
Okay, so let me give you some of the numbers. Prior to the men and women in our study entering the MBA program, women made 91% of what men made. During their internship, women made 91% of what men made. After they started their full-time jobs post the MBA, women made on average 95% of what men made. So certainly there was this narrowing, but the full bulk of the narrowing came from having done an internship. Women on average made $500 more than men after they did an internship. And every other job source, they made less. So why do I think that this helps to narrow the gender wage gap? Overall, I think it shows that when organizations can get creative about valuing and assessing talent outside of traditional methods of hiring in the labor market, all sorts of new creative ways of addressing the gender wage gap can come up. And the way that I think about this is that tryouts are really going to the mat for organizations. And what I mean by that is that MAT stands for merit, accountability, and transparency, okay? And that what organizational managers need to do is infuse merit, accountability, and transparency into all sorts of their people and people operating systems. What an internship really does is when someone is there for 3 months and they're no longer there and they've been doing great work, it provides this impetus for people to say, oh my gosh, why is this person not getting a job? Why aren't we trying to go after this individual and pay them whatever they want to be paid, right? Let's just get them back. And so with those 3 foundations, I think those are really important keys to addressing the gender wage gap and other bases of gender inequity. Okay, so with that, we have come to know the gender revolution as many things. Certainly, right now is stalled. We have certainly thought of the gender revolution as being frustrated and perhaps uneven, okay? But then there are scholars like Shelley. And so the quote that I'm going to take from Shelley's research regarding Shelley's impact comes from a paper that she calls the Small Wins paper that's published in Gender and Society. And she says to create sustainable change, we need to shift the target of change from the individual decision maker to organizational processes. This is so hard to do. Organizations for scholars so often are left as black boxes that organizations don't want to touch. We frequently are told that we're not going to get data, certainly if you're asking about gender or race or any sort of socio-demographic characteristic, forget about it. But Shelley, you have figured out a way to persevere in this area. And me personally, when I was at another institution doing a lot of work, you were a beacon of light in how to do research like this, and a beacon of light around there not needing to be a separation between having practical, important work and outstanding scholarship. And so with that today, what we want to declare this is #UnstallDay. Okay. And so, what we have for you as panelists, we wanted to have some swag up here. And so what Erin has for you is a button in case, and it's in a lanyard in case you didn't want to, mess up your clothes and put it on. But we're all going to wear it now. And thank you so much for the person that you are, your generosity, and the enormous impact that you're having on us all. Thank you.
So now I'm the one that gets to follow speaking after all these very touching remarks. Thank you. Thanks to all 3 of you. It's been a delight to get to know. It's one of the really best parts of this job, really, is getting to see the next generation of gender scholars come on and carry things forward. My talk today is called Accelerating Gender Equality, 3 Big Ideas. And it's motivated by this trend that we've been talking about the lack of progress towards gender equality. And so a lot of evidence that progress has been stalled. And when we think about the reasons why that is, I want to stop for a second and think about some of the reasons why it's not, okay? The gender revolution is not stalled because we haven't given enough attention to the problem. During the time period since the stall, gender scholars have produced hundreds of papers and books empirically demonstrating the different ways that gender inequality is reproduced and how those processes differentially affect women from different race, class, and other backgrounds. At the same time scholars were doing this work, people in organizations as diverse as technology companies, police departments, and universities have implemented many well-intentioned programs to increase the gender, racial, and other forms of diversity in their organizations and to improve their overall inclusiveness. So with all these efforts in place, my colleagues and I began to ask, why then is progress so slow? And more importantly, what do we need to do to jumpstart the progress towards gender equality? So over the past 9 years, as the director of the Clayman Institute, working along with my colleagues, I think we've come up with 3 big ideas that I like to think of as a blueprint for accelerating change. The first big idea is we need to join forces. We need to bridge the gap between theory and practice. We need to connect those scholars that are producing all those books and articles with those who are working to advance change in their organization. 5 years ago, in 2014, with support of Stanford's former President John Hennessy, we were able to test the idea that academic practice collaborations could produce change. And we launched what we're now calling an impact lab, and we invited people to join in this effort with us, forming what we called a corporate program. Today, 56 organizations have joined with us in this endeavor, which include not only companies, but also some national labs and a few universities. These collaborations are not merely convenings, just bringing people together to talk to each other, though that in of itself is important. Instead, we're doing things together, such as co-creating tools for advancing gender equality and conducting research together to evaluate our success in producing change. I'm going to share some of this research here with you in just a few moments. The second big idea, and you've heard this referenced by Adina, is we need to think small, as in small wins. That is, we need to take the larger problem of how to eliminate gender inequality and break it down into smaller, more manageable pieces where we can make visible progress. Often instead, what organizations like to do is roll out these big, bold, boil the ocean kind of approaches, which sounds so beautifully ambitious, but often make measuring progress challenging. Further, these big, broad approaches can overwhelm those tasked with implementing the change. So as a result, what we see is change agents tend to tire out and change tends to stall. Small wins, by contrast, seem doable by change agents and can more easily be measured for their effectiveness. And importantly, we can assess whether the progress we're making is progress for all women and not just some women. Further, when a small win is achieved, it can engage new allies and inspire future actions to produce more small wins, thereby creating what I'd like to call a culture of continuous improvement. So I want to share some of this research that my colleagues and I have conducted over the past several years, and I'm going to share some the research from 2 technology companies where we worked with managers to produce small wins that can be leveraged to produce larger change. So to protect the identity of these companies, as Adina said, people don't usually just give you this kind of data. To protect the identity of these companies, I'm going to refer to them as large tech and mid-sized tech. That's obviously not their real name. Both companies have leaders that are strongly committed to improving gender diversity and inclusion, and yet at both companies, the percentage of women remained quite low. And the higher up you went, the lower that percentage was, which is common across really all organizations. So at large tech, only 25% of their technical professionals were women, and as you went up to the director and above level, that went down to 15%. In both companies, we decided to conduct research on their performance assessment process to diagnose whether women were experiencing biases as they were being evaluated for promotion, for raises, and for bonuses. So why study the performance assessment process as opposed to, say, something like hiring? Well, in both companies, we found that the criteria for making evaluations were unclear. So we surveyed managers at large tech and asked them whether they thought the criteria for promotion were objective, and less than 25% of the managers said yes. So these are the people who are making the decisions, and they don't think the criteria are objective. Further, we found that there was no consistent process in place for making these evaluations. So we asked them, does your process follow a thorough and deliberate process? The great majority, okay, almost everyone said no. Okay? And why this is important is social psychology has repeatedly shown that when decision makers are tasked with making evaluations, but are given little guidelines and little criteria about how to do so, stereotypes about gender, race, and other characteristics implicitly or unconsciously bias their evaluations. In other words, another way to think of this is this kind of ambiguity around the process and around the criteria people are using opens the door to bias. So let me now share some of the results from these 2 companies. And I'll start with large tech. So in large tech, every 6 months, managers write a written review for every employee that reports to that manager, and they attach a numeric rating to that review. And this is going to be the data that I have to share with you. So we analyzed these performance reviews, and we were interested in whether managers use different kinds of language when describing men and women, and if different kinds of language led to different ratings for men and women. So we took the names off these reviews, so we didn't know what their language was. These were the people who were coding them were coding them without knowing if they were men or women. And we have a lot of findings, and I want to just share 3 of these with you. Okay? And the first has to do with something called standout language. And here I'll ask you to focus on the blue bars, which are referring to men. What the blue bars here show us is that managers were more likely to describe men using standout language, describing them as genius, game changer, and visionary about 60% of the time. 60% of that language went onto men's reviews, far less on women's reviews. We then coded something called negative communication style. Here I invite you to look at the red bars for women, okay? Here on the left, what you see is 60% of all the language about having a negative communication style was on women's reviews. And even more strikingly on the right, 76% of all the language that was calling someone out for being too aggressive went on women's reviews. Further, we found that some kinds of language paid off more in terms of higher ratings for men than for women. And I'll talk about one kind of language that we call taking charge and agentic. And here it gives you some terms. Someone who's confident, entrepreneurial, an innovator, a risk taker. These are technical workers. So you would think, right, that the more of this language, the higher your performance rating would be. And if you thought that, you would be right for men and not for women. On the left side, the blue bars are men, and what you see here is the more of that taking charge language, the higher up the rating goes, from a 2 to a 3 to a 4 to a 5. But for women, taking charge only carries you up to about a 4, and after that, there's no longer a payoff. In fact, women appear to be penalized for taking charge, being entrepreneurial, risk-taking, and the like. So that's some of the findings from large tech. I want to just say a little bit about the work we did with mid-sized tech. And here we go into a further down place in the assessment process, which is called calibration meetings. So what a calibration is after all the managers at a given level have written a review for an employee and attached a rating to it, managers at a given level enter into a calibration meeting together where their task is to smooth out or calibrate the differences between managers who might be easy graders and hard graders. Another thing to know about this is this process has a lot of grade inflation. Those of us that teach at Stanford are familiar with this concept. There are too many people in the very top bucket, okay? And that's a problem because people who get the top ratings expect to be promoted, and there's only so many promotion slots, okay? And people who get the top ratings are expecting to get the biggest bonuses and raises, and there are obviously budgetary constraints there as well. So what happens in these meetings, what was revealed to us, is there's a lot of downgrading of ratings, where people with the highest ratings, some of those people ratings get dropped down to more of a middle level, okay? So what did we find here at Midsize Tech? Well, the first thing we found in our observations of these meetings is more time was spent discussing men, period. Secondly, men were receiving more of these standout adjectives, just like we found in large tech. Third, women were receiving more criticisms of their personality, again, a similar finding to the last study. And then we found that women were more likely to get downgraded to those middle ratings than men were. There seemed to be a curious reluctance to downgrade men. So here is one of the quotes I want to share with you. "I know he's not a top performer, but if I give him a lower rating, he'll get mad and look for another job." I don't know what that's about, but it's not performance assessment. I mean, they're acknowledging he's not the top performer, but yet he's still getting the higher rating. So having established some of these patterns, we now wanted to try to intervene. And so we wanted to create a tool that would allow us to get beyond some of these biases. And we had kind of 3 design principles in mind. The first is the tool should eliminate the conditions that allow bias to flourish. Often when organizations want to reduce unconscious or implicit bias, they spend a lot of time training their employees. That can be good, but a better thing to do is to eliminate the conditions that cause bias in the first place, so getting rid of some of that ambiguity around criteria and process. The second design principle is that managers need to be a key part of the design. Not only do managers have a better sense of what kind of criteria will be relevant for evaluating people in their environment, but to the extent that you involve managers, you increase their buy-in for using the tool in the first place. And the third design principle is pure accountability is essential. What I've learned now from years of working with managers on these kinds of projects is some managers are very willing to come in and co-create tools and want to be driving this kind of change, and others come in the door kind of kicking and screaming. And so when you have managers working together to design tools and roll out tools, the peer accountability is higher and it helps achieve the tool's success. So what did we do at Midsize Tech? We want to create a tool that is going to both clarify the criteria they should be using for evaluating people and put some guardrails around their process. So the managers created a scorecard that they were going to complete for each employee and brought to the calibration meeting. We were working with them on this. One of the things that we did is we updated their criteria to reflect the values they said that they cared about and to do so in ways that allowed the criteria to be measurable. Then we replaced their open-ended questions that they had previously had on their evaluation forms with asking managers to provide specific examples of what employees did or could do better. And this is important. Open-ended questions, open boxes, open the door to bias. And then we did a lot of things to restructure the process, but the simplest was just allotting a specific amount of time for discussing each employee. So what were our small wins here? Well, we went in to observe another calibration meeting now after the scorecard intervention had been put in place. The first thing we noticed, the first thing that happened is that every manager had thoughtfully completed a scorecard for every employee. Okay, this is huge because now they're sitting there holding this thing, right? This means that they're now, not surprisingly, have greater consistency in the criteria they're using when discussing their employees. As a result, that gender difference in the criticisms of personality were eliminated, and that gender gap and downgrading of ratings was also no longer significant. And then importantly, and this is a key to this small wins model, this small win inspired other change efforts. So quickly we noticed that some of the managers began trying to modify the scorecard they were using for performance assessment to create something they could use when hiring. And then they began to broadly look around the organization for other places that they might be doing things unintentionally to undermine their diversity and inclusion goals. So looking at how their website looked, or looking at their job ads and asking themselves whether a job ad that is asking for a rock star ninja coder who wrestles problem to the ground and knocks it out of the park might not be equally appealing to all potential applicants. Now, as I said, when we work with companies like this, we call them by a pseudonym to protect their identity, and I've been calling this company Midsize Tech. But after their work with us, they decided they wanted to come out in terms of who their identity was, and so we learned this company I can now share with you is GoDaddy. And the New York Times wrote an article about our research with this headline: "If GoDaddy can turn the corner on sexism, who can't?" Referring to the fact that GoDaddy was well known in the tech world for having a sexist culture, it was well known to any sports fan for having the world's most sexist Super Bowl ads. And so what we see with GoDaddy is that one small win led to another small win, and on it went. And after a reasonably short period of time, GoDaddy became recognized among the top workplaces for women in technology. So I think what we've seen here in these studies here is that we're able to create a small win, leverage that small win to create larger change that can really make a big difference. Now, the next question has to be, okay, Shelley, you've done this in a couple of technology companies with all of your team there, okay, like what's the model for larger change? Or the way that I feel like I should ask this question, because I'm standing here in the Graduate School of Business, is how can we scale this, okay? Because we always get asked, how can we scale this across organizations? That is, how can we get people to do this without us holding their hands? So we decided to try it out first by returning to the members of our corporate program, these people who had signed up to work with us. And we explained the small wins ideology to them, and then we invited them to apply this methodology in their own company. Pick some place where you would like to make a small win, go try it, and report back to us what you've learned. And we had 19 different small wins that were on display at a recent practitioner small win showcase that we hosted. So you see there's a poster there, for example, for Airbnb, where they created this really innovative wins around what they call busting bias. We then compiled these small wins into a booklet that summarizes the results of all 19 of them. And as I look across this, what I see are a really diverse set of organizations and a diverse type of small win. So here at Stanford, the Work-Life Office created and tested a small win called Work-Life Integration Circles to help individuals work together to improve work-life experiences. The technology company Red Hat started including inclusive behaviors in their core competencies for their employees as they were evaluating them. And Charles Schwab modified job descriptions and clarified criteria for their undergrad summer intern program, which significantly increased the percentage of women in their 2018 class of interns, which connects nicely to your work, Adina. So the next stage of scaling, of course, is to see if we could have impact in organizations with whom we've never had any contact in any way. So I was very heartened to read the Stanford report a few weeks back and see this article about Stanford Biodesign, and I think some people from there have RSVP'd to be here today. And so what I learned is that Stanford Biodesign was tackling gender diversity in health technology innovations. And as I read this article, we read about that what they were doing was applying this very small wins, this methodology. So What I want to do now is to just go back to the initial question and kind of wrap things up. In the initial question, what is gender equality? What's it going to take to get us there? And I promised you 3 big ideas, and if you're keeping score at home, I've only given you 2 of them so far. Join forces and think small. So I want to conclude with one big final idea for achieving gender equality, and this is the most ambitious and will require leaders to take action. And that is this: we need to reframe the problem of gender inequality. Too often, gender equality is seen as something that's simply good for women and not essential to organizational success. We need to instead treat gender equality as a social good, much like clean water or safe neighborhoods, something that benefits us all. So let me give you one example. It's been well documented that the average productivity of the U.S. worker has increased considerably over the last 50 to 60 years. And this is good news for all of us. It raises the economy. This gain is usually attributed to technological improvements. However, a team of economists has shown that 20% of the gains in the average productivity of workers was due to the entry of women into professional work after the passage of the Civil Rights Act. Once we weren't discriminating against women, professional women sitting at home, not in the paid labor market, contributed to this increase. At an organizational level, treating gender equality as a social good would mean that leaders would approach gender diversity and inclusion more broadly using the same approaches they use for other strategic priorities. I'm going to give an example from my friend Regina Dugan, who got her PhD in mechanical engineering at Caltech and went on to become the first and so far only a director of DARPA, and then led several innovation labs for some of the major technology companies here in the Valley. She notes that research shows that only 59% of women who enter tech jobs are still in technology jobs 5 to 10 years after they enter their career. And this is a big loss. And notably, they are not leaving to go home to children. In fact, they do that less than women who are leaving other jobs. Instead, they're going to other industries where they believe they will be treated more fairly. Many companies have tried to stave off this loss by doing things like creating employee resource groups or networking opportunities for women. Some just lament the dearth of women in the pipeline. Dugan pushes back on these approaches by comparing the loss of women to other losses in other processes. She writes, if we had a manufacturing line with a 59% yield early in the process, here's what we wouldn't do to solve the problem. We wouldn't have a networking lunch. And we surely wouldn't solve that problem by putting more raw material at the beginning of the pipe. What would we do? She writes, someone would hit the big red button, form a war room, put people in it, make them accountable, and fix the problem. Now, there is nothing wrong with networking, or lunches in particular, or improving the pipeline, but this is not going to produce gender equality in our organization on its own. Women, in this case, are leaving the organization for a reason. We need to find and fix that reason. In other words, we need to solve the problem using the same approaches we would use to solve other urgent organizational priorities. This requires that our diversity and inclusion efforts be suffused in with those other priorities and not siloed. It also requires an ongoing efforts to continually work to improving diversity and inclusion outcomes. Organizations are never done with being innovative. For example, we don't say, I've been innovative once, I'm going to stop. Why should we expect to be done with improving diversity and inclusion? So we still have a long way to go to achieve gender equality. But if we join forces, think small, as in small wins, and treat gender equality as a social good, I believe we can accelerate the pace of change. To be effective, we have to assess whether the changes we put in place are benefiting all women and not just some women. While our progress has been slow, the gains we've seen so far have mostly been obtained by white women. To be sure, the change we realistically can expect to produce in any one instance is going to be small, and it's going to be imperfect and incomplete. Many gains will be eroded. Any of us who've worked on this know that. But some changes will stick, and those that do have the potential to inspire more positive change. Step by step, I believe these small wins are the pathway to achieving our larger goal, which is the transformation of our organizations and our society to be more gender equitable. Thank you. Thank you. So we now have some time for a few questions, and what I want to do is to start the questioning this way. Consistent with my goal to really prop up and think about supporting the next generation of gender scholars, I've asked 2 people to ask the first question. And the first is going to be Professor Cecilia Ridgway, who many of you here in the room know. Cecilia Ridgway, Stanford professor, was my dissertation advisor. And so she's the person that sort of got me on the path to doing this kind of work. And I asked her to ask the first question. And then the second question is going to be asked by Brittany Cook, who is a first-year student in our PhD program here at Stanford and one of my newest mentees. And then after that, we will turn to audience questions. And I'd like to ask the panelists now to come up to the stage. When we're asking questions, we can ask a question of any panelist or of the panel, anybody, any specific person you want to. What I will say is when we get to the public Q&A, what I will be asking is that if you get called on to ask a question, please ask a question, don't make a speech, okay? Or else I'll just rudely cut you off. All this stuff about being nice is wrong. And if you ask the question, ask it quickly, because that way we'll have time for a few more questions, okay? So Cecilia. And we have mic runners who will bring mics up.
First of all, this is wonderful, absolutely wonderful, everything about it, inspirational, but also first-class research. So it's a real way forward, I think. And then I'm going to abuse my position by, rather than so much asking you folks a question, is to point something out for all of us, which is if you notice that everyone here has talked about organizational change and small steps as the way, small wins as the way to actually change things, change the organizations we all live and work in, if you want to get gender inequality. But a critic standing back might say, isn't the undertow that all of you have mentioned, these large cultural ideas about what's masculinity, what's femininity, who are we, what are our identities, the self-expressive aspects, the devaluing of the deep beliefs about devaluing. So you might say, well, wait a minute, isn't that big cultural stuff? What do we do with it? Isn't that undermining all these organizational change kinds of things? And if you would allow me to answer my own question, I like about you guys.
You can do anything you want, Cecilia.
This is what I like about you guys. You see that there, and you're going here. Why go there if that's the problem? Because, right, by giving people these routine experiences in another way of life, you give them the feedback that gradually feeds into the cultural systems, that starts to undermine our sense of who men and women are and why it has to be this way. Undermine the devaluing, undermine the beliefs that women come to the workplace with a lot of baggage, undermine all that, which allows us to address broader questions like work-family, like everything. So that's what I love about this. It's the thin end of the wedge that goes into changing the culture.
Thank you. It's beautiful, Cecilia, as always.
Wow, that's a tough act to follow.
Cecilia always is.
So it seems to me that a lot of these barriers are being dismantled, but at the same time, others are being built or strengthened. And Erin, your work has touched a lot on organizational culture as one of these strengthening barriers, but you've also made it pretty clear that there's a great deal going on at the individual level that's barring gender parity. So I was wondering if you could talk more about how these two things are working simultaneously. So changes in organizational culture, and then also at the same time changes in individual schemas of work, and how those things are working together in order to create new barriers to gender equality.
Yeah, great. Is my mic on?
Yeah.
Great. Thank you so much for a great question, and this panel's been amazing. I'm so honored to be here. Your question is very difficult, but I think one of the things that's important to keep in mind is the way that we tend to think about the solutions to these things on an individual level, and one of the implications for the passion principle is that it plays into neoliberal ideas about individual responsibility and really turns us away from more collective solutions. And so I think that is a way that these things really interplay with one another, that we have to think about organizational change that might help the individual, but we also need to think about how we're amplifying the ability for individual workers to advocate for themselves collectively. And at the same token, if we're thinking about the potential complexities or problems of allowing everyone to follow their passion without thinking about how that might amplify things like the ideal worker norm, we have to think about how can we expand that to think about people working together collectively, because ultimately when we think about what what's happened since the 1970s, the destruction of unions, the movement away from thinking about workers as having kind of lifelong career trajectories to jobs, to even sort of task by task hiring, a lot of that has started to erode.
Okay, so we have time for some questions, and there are 3 people with mics. I'm just going to kind of point to them, and we'll start, with you, Sandra.
Thank you very much for a very interesting discussion here and for your presentations. Here's my question. I'm thinking about gender equality in the workforce. Has your definition of what that means changed since, or stayed the same since you started these projects? And I'd like to address that to each of you.
I don't think my definition of what gender equality has changed so much since I started this work, but I do think that what I've learned to see is some of the more insidious ways it's produced in organizations. I mean, when I started at the Clayman Institute, it was the first time I started doing work within organizations, and got to sit in on some decision-making processes that we don't usually get to see. I mean, even when you're yourself, when you were hired or promoted, right? I mean, somebody told us once that the most important decisions that are ever made about you won't be in the room for, and that's even more true for researchers. We don't get to see this stuff. So I've really learned more, I think, about the kind of insidious ways that that these inequalities are produced. Adina's your example you showed with Jack and Ann or whatever. It's kind of, just how these kind of conversations actually unfold, where it's these subtle assumptions that we have about men and women, and also our sometimes very wrong assumptions about what would make a productive worker. I mean, we hear people sometimes talking about, the criteria they want someone to have, and then there's no evidence whatsoever that criteria predicts success. It may be a criteria that some groups have more of, but that's not the same thing as saying it's a criteria on which people should be evaluated. I don't know if anybody else wants to.
So in many ways, my view of gender inequity has evolved, but I will say not really changed. So it's deepened, and I've come to appreciate that equity is something fundamental that we all want. Men want it, women want it. And so if we can keep equity at the forefront, I think we can have a broader discussion where we're better aligned around these issues. And especially going forward, it helps this feel like it's not zero sum. I think something that's common about all of our research is it's not about women winning so men can't win. It's fundamentally about the world being more equitable and organizations being more equitable.
Okay, there's microphones in the back. Does somebody have there's a question up here. Yeah, I guess Sandra, is that?
Thank you so much. I'm curious, and this might transfer over to organizational behavior, but how we tie these metrics around diversity inclusion to business metrics, because what I loved about your last quote, Shelley, was if we looked at it as a manufacturing company, we would change everything, right, and run it like a business. So I've heard different companies say we shouldn't have diversity metrics and have compensation tied to it because it can have unintended consequences. Other companies say the exact opposite. I'm curious if there's any research backing either horse.
Yes. So we know a lot about, especially at the team level, when teams are more diverse, they perform better, they're more innovative, they're more creative. And also at the organizational level, we have evidence of some of those same metrics. And so,
I meant tying the metrics to like a leader. So you as the CEO and you as the CFO are going to be measured on your diversity improvement of, your like
right. Choosing
a number.
Right. So I'll just repeat it since not everybody maybe heard it. It was about the leader being tied to kind of improving diversity. I mean, I believe that that's true, but offhand, I can't think of any studies that
I'm with you. There's a lot of people trying lots of things, and I think this is it's a reasonably new thing, and it's not anything that we have data on. I mean, I think to your point, though, it's one of these kind of things. There's a lot of things that sound like a really good idea, and I think we always have to be measuring to see what the unintended negative consequences could be to that. If people are sort of gaming the system in a way that doesn't, So, but I don't know, and I don't have an answer to it. It's a future study.
Future study, not future work.
Okay, way over here. Great.
Thank you, everyone, and especially Shelley. It's so exciting to hear about the research moving out into the real world and the scholarship moving back and forth between the two. And I love that you were talking about how to amplify these ideas that seem to be effective. And I'd like you to say a little bit more about how to do that. Like there's evidence in your work so far that it can be done without so much hand-holding, but even within Stanford, what would it take to really accelerate that uptake?
Yeah, I mean, I do, the jury's out on this still, but I really do think that our next task in my lab is to really write up this methodology in a way that is more accessible to people and try to get that out there. And, for us, what we would be looking for is monitoring the impact in terms of uptake and using that methodology to produce success without us being involved. So I think in general, that's what you want, is sort of the lessons learned from research to trickle out. And, we've tried to accelerate this a bit by working with the companies and organizations we have access to so we can provide more examples of how this actually works. And I love, with our showcase, we just had so many different kinds of small wins and so many different kinds of organizations that were participating. We were able to go back and kind of look at the lessons learned from that, and we're going to use that to write a methodology for doing this. And I think that's the thing, is to try to get that out. And one of our big avenues for doing that is to not only write research articles that, establish that the methodology works, but to translate that work into things that are more accessible. So we have spent a lot of time lately turning the tools we've learned into things like HBR articles or things that are much more accessible to people. So that's my idea of right now for how to kind of to spread the word, if you would. Okay, over here.
I'll just join the chorus of thank you so much, and I'll just say 30 seconds that I was one of Shelley's fellows, and that my favorite thing about being a fellow of Shelley's was you don't apply, you just get plucked out of the email, and then she always kept it to 1 hour, which is a genius at Stanford.
Nothing but a timekeeper.
But my question is actually for Adina, which I really appreciate. I appreciated all the work, but I just wanted to talk a little bit about the length of the internship. Mm-hmm. So because I'm a Stanford person, the length of the internship for the assistant professor is 7 years. And it's not, it's not 12 weeks. And I do think that gap, and it's not only academics, it's law partners and so on. Is there any research, either your own or others in organizational behavior, and maybe David, you know about this, that thinks about that trial period at all? Because I do think that some of the kind of negative communication style, some of this other stuff happens over time in a way that the 12-week internship doesn't. I'm not sure because I'm in the arts, but can you talk a little bit about that?
Right, and so just so I make sure I understand your question, it's does the length of time allow some of those negative feedback processes to come into play? So this is a new area of research, and not many people are focused on it. But it's a big part of my research agenda. One of the key parts of the internship is really that assessment and that decision. Do I hire this person long term? And so I think one of the things that's nice about that internship is that it provides a focus for the organization on that aspect. And it's not that some of these other processes still can't ensue, they certainly can, but it's that decision that is really key at the end. And I think that actually is quite different from some other work on returnships and some other things that don't have that kind of mandate. I've got to make that decision at the end. And that's an important component.
It's really interesting to think about the time horizon, though, and and maybe the difference between promotion and hiring as well. It's a further direction. Okay, I'm looking for the microphone. You got one? Okay.
Hi, thank you. I'm a new fan, Shelley, so thank you for letting me come. I'm from Slack, and I'm going to be rethinking our networking luncheons. Or I'm going to have to bring
Where would your free lunch, folks?
But my question or comment or whatever was about the neuroscience with the scorecard approach, because we did an interview for a D&I professional at Slack using the scorecard. And what I noticed was the group of us who were evaluating, it was a lot less emotional based and much more logical, like we have to assign a number, we have to explain why we picked that number. So I wonder if you do it or have looked at any of that, because I think that was very effective.
Yeah. I mean, I think that's one thing that it does is it makes people, I mean, not only are you using criteria as opposed to whatever pops into your head, but it's slowing you down a bit as well. So, that's what gets past some of those biases that can, emerge very quickly, is your decision making is slowed down quite a bit. So I think that's a key part of it. And on the less emotional stuff, I've observed that as well. The discussions tend to take on a much more rational form. I mean, obviously they would be. If we go in to do something and we all have like the same rules we're playing by, it's going to be a lot less chaotic feeling than if everybody comes in, whatever they did last is what's on their mind before they walked into the meeting. So that makes a lot of sense. And the other thing I will say about this scorecard kind of way of doing things too has been that the managers who worked on developing these scorecards with us that were enthusiastic, of course they loved it. But even the most reluctant managers, by the end, you would hear them saying, when you think about it, this actually makes a manager's job easier. Which is kind of like, yeah, I guess if you knew what you're doing, it would always be easier to do your job. So it does have this way of kind of bringing people on board. And I would say even for people who are not really certain they want to work on diversity and inclusion, if they end up with a tool that makes performance assessment easier for them, they're fine. If there's also increases in diversity and inclusion outcomes. I think over Deborah Rohde has a question, if you could. Mm-hmm.
And I say this as working in the legal profession for most.
Oh, I thought you were saying working at Stanford.
But shows a different audience. Because, for example, I was giving a talk in a big ballroom about why women's leadership has stalled out in the legal profession. It's like the statistics you showed from politics to business. And the conventional wisdom among all these well-meaning leaders was, well, women aren't leaning in.
Mm-hmm.
And now they've got a book that's insightful.
Mm-hmm.
And I gave a talk saying, well, here are all the other reasons why women might not be underrepresented. Wouldn't have, I think, told anyone in this room they didn't already know about implicit bias and favoritism. And after the talk, a young woman came up to me and she said, this was so inspiring, it was so dispiriting. Inspiring because you just validated everything that I have experienced in the law firm I've been working for the last 5 years. And dispiriting because the managing partner who was sitting next to me turned up to me towards the end and said, aren't you glad we don't have any of these problems at all? So it seems to me that one of the hopeful ways that you all did talk about in terms of social change now, but in an era of #MeToo being discovered, is the power of voice in social media. So think Susan Thelmer at Uber.
Mm-hmm.
Without any intervention from the legal system, she just put the evidence up on a post that went viral, and 20 executives lost their jobs in the investigation.
Yeah.
Women are finding that in a whole variety of organizations.
Yeah, and I think I agree. I mean, I agree totally. And I think it's always easier to change an organization that realizes they have a problem. Okay, and especially if they have leadership support for changes, and that leaves out a lot of organizations that are lacking those two things. But we do, I think, benefit greatly right now from the peer pressure that organizations put on each other, right? So when technology companies start posting their numbers of how they're doing, nobody wants to be on the bottom, and that starts to motivate change. I think in the legal field, right, sort of the public data that's available at the Stanford Law School about what percentage of associates and partners are women, students are looking at that. People know they're looking at that. And so I think that there's a way of putting sort of peer pressure at the organizational level as well. And social media can only help with that, especially when something comes out that's really quite egregious. I don't know if anybody else.
I think that's great.
Yeah, I was going to add to Shelley's comment that I think the small wins work that Shelley's doing is so important because as organizations start to do this work and then their peers are starting to see that it's happening, it becomes, in sociology we talk about it as mimetic isomorphism, right? These companies are going to have to start doing the same things. They're going to start copying each other. There's going to be these pressures to comply with what their competitors are doing, and I think that that's these sorts of things breed more companies doing these sorts of things, and so the small wins are a great place to start.
And thank you for the question. That was, for those of you who didn't see, that's Deborah Rohde. She is a law professor here at Stanford and also a former director of the Clayman Institute. So thank you for being here. Okay, who's the microphone over here somewhere? Oh,
Hi, my name is V. Nettles. As a fellow gender and sexuality scholar from the University of Las Vegas, Nevada. So thank you for this panel. This is my first time. I am a fan of all of you right now. Please forgive me, I wrote down my question.
Okay.
God forbid I keep a thought in my head for 30 seconds. But this is for Erin. Actually, your research on the pleasure principle talks a lot about self-expression and how that might cause inequity through self-selection. In my own research, certain types of self-expression are evaluated differently according to race. So my question is, in your research, did you find a difference or were you able to see a gap in race and self-expression or in your pleasure principle?
Yeah, excellent. Just a quick correction, passion principle, but I like pleasure principle as well for the next study.
Took your research in a whole new direction.
Exactly. All alliteration. Exactly. It's a problem. A lot of the stuff I do starts with P. It's very, very confusing. Thank you for that question. That's really fantastic. So certainly there is differences in the way that that self-expression or the kinds of characteristics that people seek to express manifest by gender, by race, by transgender status, etc. However, what was really interesting here in my research is that the expectation that everyone have the opportunity to express themselves and base their career decisions or other life decisions on the basis of their sense of self is pretty consistent. So there's no expectation that you get to follow your passion, but you don't. And I think that actually ends up reinforcing the process because it what I call choice washes existing patterns of social disadvantage as the outcome of individual passion seeking, of individual choice making. And so again, playing into this notion of a neoliberal workplace where we select into things that we're interested in, and if we work hard, we can be successful, really undermines the efforts that we're trying to undertake to be able to make things more equitable.
So we are out of time, and but the good news is, you've in a reward for sitting and listening to us is there will be a reception out on the courtyard behind you with some food and drinks and things like that. I want to thank you all for being here. So many people in this room have been on this journey with us throughout the entire time of my directorship. And again, I'll just reiterate what I said at the beginning. The progress we've made has really been a collective effort. And going forward, the only way we transform things is large collaborations of diverse people with diverse backgrounds working together. And so I hope you're all inspired to take up that mantle and do your part. Thank you.